I have to admit, I was quite startled by this fresh proof of just how practical my companion's theories really were. My respect for his powers of analysis grew even stronger. And yet, a part of me couldn't shake the suspicion that the whole thing had been staged, perhaps just to impress me. But for what reason? I couldn't begin to understand. When I glanced at him, he had already finished reading the note. His eyes had that vacant, distant look, a sure sign that he was deep in thought. I asked him, "How on earth did you figure that out?"
Figure what out?
That he was a retired sergeant of Marines.
I have no time for trifles,
He said shortly. Then, with a faint smile, he added,
Forgive my rudeness. You interrupted my thoughts, but perhaps it's just as well. So, you really didn't notice that the man was a sergeant of Marines?
"No, certainly not."
It was easier to see than to explain. If someone asked you to prove that 2 and 2 make 4, you might struggle to put it into words, but you'd still know it to be true, even from across the street. I could see a large blue anchor tattooed on the back of his hand. That told me he had a connection to the sea, but his posture was unmistakably military, and he had regulation side whiskers. That pointed to the Marines. Beyond that, he carried himself with authority, with a certain air of command. You must have noticed the way he held his head high, how he swung his cane. He was steady, respectable, middle-aged. It all suggested that he had been a sergeant.
"Amazing,"
Merely elementary.
he said, though the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes did not escape me.
I said just now that there were no criminals. It seems I was mistaken. Look at this.
He tossed me the note the commissionaire had just delivered. "My God, this is terrible."
It does seem a little out of the ordinary. Would you mind reading it aloud?
I unfolded the letter and read, "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there's been a bad business during the night at 3 Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road. Our man on the beat saw a light there about 2 in the morning, and as the house was an empty one, suspected that something was amiss. He found the door open, and in the front room, which is bare of furniture, discovered the body of a gentleman, well dressed, and having cards in his pocket bearing the name of Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, U.S. There had been no robbery, nor is there any evidence as to how the man met his death. There are marks of blood in the room, but there is no wound upon his person. We are at a loss as to how he came into the empty house. Indeed, the whole affair is a puzzler. If you can come round to the house any time before 12, you will find me there. I have left everything in statu quo until I hear from you. If you are unable to come, I shall give you fuller details, and would esteem it a great kindness if you would favor me with your opinion. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson."
Gregson is the smartest of the Scotland Yard detectives. He and Lestrade are the best of a bad bunch. They are both quick and energetic, but hopelessly conventional. They also have a fierce rivalry, almost like 2 jealous actresses. If they are both assigned to this case, it should make for some entertainment.
I was amazed at how calmly he discussed the situation. I exclaimed, "Surely there's no time to waste. Shall I go and call a cab?"
I'm not sure if I'll go. I am the most incurably lazy man that ever stood in shoe leather when the mood takes me. But I can be active enough when I feel like it.
"But this is exactly the kind of case you've been longing for."
My dear fellow, what difference does it make? If I solve it, you can be sure Gregson, Lestrade, and the rest will take all the credit. That's the downside of being an unofficial person.
"But he's asking for your help."
Yes, he knows that I am his superior and acknowledges it, at least to me. But he would rather bite his tongue off than admit it to anyone else. Still, we may as well take a look. I'll solve it on my own terms. If nothing else, it will be amusing.
He suddenly became energized, throwing on his overcoat and moving about briskly.
Get your hat.
"You wish me to come?"
Yes, if you have nothing better to do.
A minute later, we were both in a hansom, driving furiously for the Brixton Road. It was a foggy, cloudy morning, and a dun-colored veil hung over the housetops. looking like the reflection of the mud-colored streets beneath. My companion was in the best of spirits and prattled away about Cremona fiddles and the difference between a Stradivarius and an Amati. As for me, I remained silent. The dreary weather and the grim nature of our errand had finally dampened my spirits. Interrupting Holmes' discussion of musical craftsmanship, I said, "You don't seem very focused on the case."
I don't have enough data yet. It is a fundamental mistake to theorize before gathering all the evidence. It biases the judgment.
You'll have your data soon. This is Brixton Road, and that must be the house, if I am not mistaken.
So it is. Stop the carriage. Driver, stop.
We were still about 100 yards from the house, but Holmes insisted that we get out and walk the rest of the way. Number 3, Lauriston Gardens had an ominous and forbidding appearance. It was one of 4 houses set slightly back from the street. 2 were occupied, while the other 2 stood empty. The vacant houses had 3 tiers of bleak and dreary windows, some adorned with to let signs that clung to the panes like cataracts on a blind eye. A small, neglected garden with sparse, sickly plants separated the buildings from the street. A narrow, yellowish pathway, apparently a mix of clay and gravel, ran through it. The ground was damp and muddy from the night's rain. The garden was enclosed by a 3-foot brick wall topped with wooden railings. Leaning against this wall stood a burly police constable, surrounded by a small crowd of onlookers, craning their necks in hopes of glimpsing something inside. I had expected Sherlock Holmes to rush inside and immediately begin examining the crime scene. Instead, he strolled casually up and down the pavement, seemingly indifferent to the urgency of the case. He gazed absent-mindedly at the ground, the sky, the neighboring houses, and the railings. His nonchalance struck me as almost theatrical under the circumstances. Once he finished his apparent survey, he slowly walked along the edge of the garden, carefully avoiding the main pathway. His eyes were fixed on the ground. Twice he paused, and once I saw him smile and utter an exclamation of satisfaction. The damp earth bore numerous footprints, but with police officers having trampled over it repeatedly, I doubted that anything useful could be discerned. Still, given what I had already witnessed of Holmes' perceptive abilities, I had no doubt that he saw something that had escaped me entirely. As we approached the house, we were met by a tall, pale-faced man with flaxen hair and a notebook in hand. He rushed forward and shook Holmes' hand with enthusiasm.
"I truly appreciate you coming. I've left everything untouched."
Except that.
Pointing at the muddied pathway, my friend said,
A herd of buffaloes couldn't have made a bigger mess. Surely, Gregson, you made your observations before allowing this?
"I have been busy inside the house. My colleague, Mr. Lestrade, is here. I had relied on him to manage the exterior."
Holmes glanced at me and raised his eyebrows with a sardonic expression.
With 2 such capable men as you and Lestrade on the scene, I suppose there won't be much left for me to discover.
Gregson rubbed his hands together with satisfaction.
"I believe we have done all that can be done. It's a peculiar case, though, and I knew you would be interested."
You did not arrive in a cab.
"No, sir."
Nor did Lestrade?
"No, sir."
Then let us go inside.
Without another word, Holmes strode into the house, Gregson following behind, his face filled with astonishment. A short, dusty passage led from the front door to the kitchen and other rooms. 2 doors opened off the hallway. One, judging by its undisturbed layer of dust, had been closed for weeks. The other door led to the dining room, where the mysterious event had taken place. Holmes entered first, and I followed with that peculiar sensation of unease that the presence of death inspires. It was a large, square room, made even more spacious by the total absence of furniture. The walls were covered in garish wallpaper, now peeling in places, revealing yellow plaster beneath. Dark blotches of mildew marred the surface. Opposite the door stood an ostentatious fireplace, its mantelpiece made of imitation white marble. A red wax candle, burnt down to a stump, was stuck in one corner of it. The single window was so coated with grime that the incoming light was murky and gray, casting a dull, lifeless tone over the room. The dust that covered every surface only deepened the oppressive atmosphere. I noticed these details later. At the time, my attention was fixed solely on the grim, motionless figure sprawled across the floor. The man lay stiffly on his back, his vacant, sightless eyes staring up at the discolored ceiling. He appeared to be around 43 or 44 years old, middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with crisp, curly black hair and a short, stubbly beard. He was dressed in a heavy broadcloth frock coat and waistcoat, light-colored trousers, and an immaculate collar and cuffs. Beside him on the floor sat a well-brushed, tidy-top hat. His hands were clenched, his arms flung outward, and his legs locked together, as if he had struggled fiercely in his final moments. But it was his face that struck me most. A twisted expression of horror, and perhaps hatred, was frozen upon his rigid features. I had never seen such a look on a dead man's face before. The low forehead, blunt nose, and prominent jawline gave him an oddly simian appearance, which was only made worse by the unnatural contortion of his body. I had encountered death in many forms, but never before had it seemed so ghastly as in that grim, dust-filled room in the heart of suburban London. Standing by the doorway, as lean and ferret-like as ever, was Lestrade. He acknowledged Holmes and me with a nod.
This case is going to cause a sensation, sir. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen, and I'm no novice.
No clues at all?
None at all.
Sherlock Holmes stepped forward, knelt beside the body, and examined it with great care.
Are you certain there is no wound?
He asked, gesturing to the dark patches of blood scattered around the corpse.
Positive.
They both replied.
Then this blood must belong to a second person, presumably the murderer, if this is indeed a murder. It reminds me of the case of Van Jansen in Utrecht in 1834. Do you recall it, Gregson?
No, sir.
You should read about it. There's nothing new under the sun. It has all been done before.
As he spoke, Holmes' hands moved with remarkable speed, feeling, pressing, unbuttoning, inspecting, while his eyes bore that distant, analytical expression I'd come to recognize. The thoroughness of his examination was astonishing, though it was conducted so swiftly that a casual observer might not have realized its depth. Finally, he leaned in, sniffed the dead man's lips, and then examined the soles of his patent leather boots.
The body has not been moved?
No more than was necessary for the purposes of our examination.
Then you can take him to the mortuary. There's nothing more to learn from him.
Gregson had a stretcher and 4 men at hand. At his call, they entered the room, and the stranger was lifted and carried out. As they raised him, a ring tinkled down and rolled across the floor. Lestrade grabbed it up and stared at it with mystified eyes.
A woman's been here. It's a wedding ring.
He held it up on the palm of his hand. We all gathered around him and examined it. There could be no doubt that the simple gold band had once adorned the finger of a bride.
This complicates matters. Heaven knows they were complicated enough before.
Are you sure it doesn't simplify them? There's nothing to be learned by just staring at it. What did you find in his pockets?
We have it all here.
Gregson replied, pointing to an assortment of objects placed on one of the bottom steps of the staircase.
A gold watch, number 97163 by Barraud of London. Gold Albert chain, very heavy and solid. Gold ring with Masonic device. Gold pin, bulldog's head with rubies as eyes. Russian leather card case with cards of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland, corresponding with the EJD upon the linen. No purse, but loose money to the extent of £7.13. Pocket edition of Boccaccio's Decameron with name of Joseph Stangerson upon the flyleaf. 2 letters, one addressed to E.J. Drebber and one to Joseph Stangerson.
At what address?
American Exchange, Strand, to be left till called 4. Both letters are from the Guion Steamship Company and contain details about their sailings from Liverpool. It's clear this unfortunate man was preparing to return to New York.
Have you made any inquiries about this man, Stan Gerson?
I did it immediately, sir. We've sent advertisements to all the newspapers, and one of my men went to the American Exchange, but he hasn't returned yet.
Have you sent inquiries to Cleveland?
We telegraphed this morning.
How did you phrase your inquiries?
We simply detailed the circumstances and asked for any information that could help us.
You didn't request specifics about any crucial detail?
I asked about Stan Gerson.
Nothing else? Is there no particular element upon which this entire case hinges? Will you not send another telegram?
I've said all I have to say.
Sherlock Holmes chuckled to himself and seemed about to respond when Lestrade re-entered the hallway, rubbing his hands with an air of self-satisfaction.
Mr. Gregson, I've just made a discovery of the highest importance, something that would have been completely overlooked if I hadn't examined the walls carefully.
The little man was practically glowing with pride, delighted to have outdone his colleague.
Come here.
He said, bustling back into the now vacant front room.
Now stand right there.
He struck a match on his boot and held it up against the wall.
Look at that.
I had already noted that sections of the wallpaper were peeling away. In one corner of the room, a large patch had come loose, exposing the coarse yellow plaster beneath. Across this bare surface, scrawled in blood-red letters, was a single word: rake.
What do you think of that?
Lestrade asked, his voice filled with pride, like a showman unveiling his prize attraction.
This was overlooked because it's in the darkest part of the room, and no one thought to look here. The murderer must have written it in his own blood. See this smear where it trickled down the wall? That rules out suicide. Now, why did the killer choose this corner to write it? I'll tell you. Look at that candle on the mantelpiece. It was burning at the time, which means this corner would have been the brightest part of the room, not the darkest.
And what does it mean now that you found it?
What does it mean? It means the writer started to write the name Rachel, but was interrupted. Mark my words, when this case is solved, we'll find a woman named Rachel is involved. It's all very well for you to laugh, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You may be very smart and clever, but the old hound is the best when all is said and done.
My sincere apologies. You certainly have the honor of being the first to discover this, and I agree. It does seem to have been written by someone else involved in last night's events. I haven't had time to examine the room yet, but with your permission, I'll do so now.
As he was speaking, he pulled out a measuring tape and a large magnifying glass from his pocket. Without another word, he began moving soundlessly around the room, sometimes stopping to take measurements, occasionally kneeling, and even lying flat on the floor once. The entire time, he muttered to himself, a constant stream of exclamations, whistles, and small cries of encouragement. Watching him, I couldn't help but be reminded of a well-trained foxhound darting back and forth, sniffing eagerly for a lost scent. For over 20 minutes, he continued his examination. He carefully measured distances between marks that were completely invisible to me and even used his tape to take measurements on the walls for reasons beyond my understanding. In one spot, he gathered a small pile of gray dust from the floor and packed it neatly into an envelope. Finally, he turned his attention to the word on the wall, examining each letter with minute precision through his magnifying glass. Once satisfied, he tucked both the tape and the glass back into his pocket.
They say genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains. Not the best definition, but it certainly fits detective work.
Gregson and Lestrade had been watching Sherlock Holmes' unusual behavior with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Clearly, they failed to grasp what I had begun to realize, that every seemingly odd action Holmes took was purposeful and aimed at a precise conclusion.
Well, what do you make of it, sir?
Holmes spoke with an unmistakable air of sarcasm.
It would be robbing you of the credit if I were to presume to help you. You are doing so well on your own that it would be a shame for anyone to interfere.
Gregson and Lestrade exchanged uncertain glances.
However, if you keep me informed on your investigation, I'd be happy to assist in any way I can. In the meantime, I'd like to speak with the constable who found the body. Can you give me his name and address?
Lestrade flipped open his notebook.
John Rance. He is off duty now. You will find him at 46 Audley Court, Kennington Parkgate.
Holmes noted the address down quickly.
Come along, Doctor. Let's go have a word with him.
Just as we were about to leave, Holmes turned back to the two detectives.
Before we go, let me share something that might help you. There's been a murder here, and the killer was a man, over 6 feet tall, in his prime, with unusually small feet for his height. He wore coarse, square-toed boots and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar. He arrived with his victim in a 4-wheeled cab, drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on its off foreleg. Most likely, he had a florid complexion and remarkably long fingernails on his right hand. These are just a few observations, but perhaps they'll be of some use to you.
Lestrade and Gregson glanced at each other with an incredulous smile.
If this man was murdered, how was it done?
Poison.
Without another word, he strode towards the door.
Oh, one more thing, Lestrade. Rake is the German word for revenge. So don't waste your time looking for a Miss Rachel.
With that final remark, he walked away, leaving the two Scotland Yard detectives standing in stunned silence.